Okay, so I think my sharing will be a bit different from what Paramita was saying. I think I will be sharing from a more personal perspective of organizing and finding my way through the several years that I've begun working as both a teacher and as the founder and organizer of Women's Festival. So I want to share my journey of how do I come to the realization of the importance of intimacy or the different forms of intimacy, as well as how to make room, or why is it important to make room for intimacy, especially in this age where we are in this very digitized age. Wait. And so for the past few years, the time frame that I will be discussing is within the past few years, the past four or 5 years, and so for me, to give a better idea of how I started the journey, I will go a bit far back to 2014, but primarily I will be discussing it against the background of the anti-extradition movement in Hong Kong, beginning in 2019, as well as COVID-19, which began around like late 2019 to early 2020 in Hong Kong. And just a very quick word about like if the anti-extradition movement and COVID-19 taught me one thing, it is that we belong with other people. And for me, it is a journey of, apart from all the things that happens in Hong Kong, it is for me a journey of rediscovering the need of intimacy. And I think I'm in a very different place than when Teju interviewed me like many years ago for when the project like first began. And so when Teju approached me with this symposium, I was thinking about several questions, especially like very much rooted in the situation that Hong Kong or the world in general is in right now. Is it when we have so little control over our bodies, how do we get in touch with what we need in a time when especially touch itself is dangerous? The second question is that how can we understand or imagine intimacy after living so long in mistrust and fear? So part of it is because of like health hazard, COVID-19, but the other thing is also about like political instability, internal conflict, and the general sense of being threatened or being unsafe. And so probably some of you know about the anti-extradition movement in Hong Kong. And one of the main feature of it is, apart from the very intense physical conflict, is that this the movement is largely communicated, formed, and mobilized through digital platforms. And so the digital platform in many sense is seen as the true public space, or the safer public space, or the parallel like fighting ground during the extradition movement. And so that also leads to like Hong Kong people being actually very used before the whole world shuts down and like turning to Zoom. We have been using Zoom for a very long, for almost a year, because of the extradition movement, because of the social unrest, because of like campus being unsafe. That's why Hong Kong people was like making the very swift and actually quite natural transition from Zooming because of like political conflict and Zooming because of COVID-19. And so we started like a bit earlier than everyone else. But then it also leads to this digital mediation of most kind of human contact, one that is really prolonged. So when probably everyone else started like digitizing their communication in around like early 2020, we were already like half a year or more than half a year into doing that. And so that probably gives you a bit of idea of the background of where I begin like thinking about this sharing. And another context is because when parameters like sharing is mainly about like relationship, sexual intimacy, seeking for pleasure. My understanding or my take on the word intimacy is one that is on one hand more broadly speaking about connection, about kinship, about friendship, about family, but also like actual physical intimacy in terms of like interpersonal physical touch and being in proximity with one another. And the context for it is, I think, to talk about the body and being close to each other, or like physical interaction with one another. I think this is something that is shared between like probably friends from India and friends from Hong Kong or other big cities, is that we live in a extremely crowded place. And this is a protest scene, because I can see that there are some cameras at the back. But that on the left-hand side, when there's a bus, this is actually like normal day, everyday Hong Kong. And on the right, it is like protests, like Hong Kong streets during protests. And you can't see, like, I would say that there is not a very big difference like between the two of them. And so Hong Kong people is not a big fan of being around other people, because from day to day, they are around a lot of people like all the time. And they become very defensive. They become very defensive of their own private space. On the other hand, but they are also quite interestingly very used to being in very close proximity with other people, probably much more comfortable so, or much more unwillingly, but comfortably so than most people in like other societies. And so one thing that you would notice when you are in Hong Kong is that people are very intensively using their cell phones in public spaces, especially when they are commuting. For me, I do understand it, and especially when you look at this kind of packness, this kind of crowdedness, that you are constantly surrounded by other bodies. I would understand it as everyone trying to, they try to avoid eye contact. They plug their ears because they don't want to listen to what other people are saying. And the other thing is really to have their own space within a space that packs you like a sardine. And so to think about the place of bodies. So Hong Kong people, as someone who lives in Hong Kong, I've always been ambivalent about physical distance and the idea of physical contact, because after a prolonged period of time of not having to physically leave my home in order to work, when I stepped onto the public transportation, I do realize that bodies touches, like everyone body touches that of each other, however unintentionally, but necessarily. So there is that, there was a very long time where I didn't travel on public transportation, and then I sat there and I realized that my legs are touching that of a stranger who I do not know who he is, and we will never meet each other again. But then we share the same chair. Our legs are touching each other, and I can feel his body temperature. And it's a very physical feeling of being in a city or being in proximity with each other. And the other thing about it is that because when we think about the anti-extradition movement, which involves a lot of very intense physical conflict, as well as like COVID-19 being one that puts a lot of restriction on bodies, as well as changing people's perception of bodies touching, being equal to warmth, or being equal to comfort, or being equal to affection, or being equal to intimacy, because the touch is now being redefined as something that is deadly, something that is potentially lethal, or at least something that's risky and dangerous and unnecessary. And so these few years combined together is a very physical, for me, it's a very bodily, very physical experience of bodies being moved involuntarily together or involuntarily apart. So my entry point to this, to discussing like the idea of or rediscovering the importance of connection and intimacy, however you understand it, is from my experience at the Gender Studies program at CUK, as well as me being the curator working with my two partners for the Women's Festival Hong Kong. So probably I would begin by talking about my experience as a teacher, because I started that like a bit earlier. So as a teacher, I started in 2014. And from the photo, you can see that it was I started studying PhD and started being a teaching assistant at Ningnan at cultural studies at Ninh Nam in January 2014, and the umbrella movement started in late 2014, and it was the moment I saw on that particular day, on 28th of September, when Hong Kong police, for many years, they haven't used tear gas at all. And on that day, they used it on the public. And on that very day, I remember I was somewhere here. And after this, I ran into a student in the bathroom, a student of cultural study in the bathroom. And at that moment, I realized that I'm her teacher. And so I started against this background. It was a very antagonizing start because it was a moment where I realized that we are all human. And being a teacher also means, because I have all the fantasies and illusion growing up in a rather old-fashioned way, that teachers is something that that you look up to, and they kind of like not operate on the same plane. I do not know where I got that idea. But I realized at that moment that bodies are fragile. My body is as fragile as hers, or that her body is as fragile as ours, as mine, and that we are all fragile in front of state power or ideas or weapons or whatever. And I understand that power is a physical act that acts on the body, because our bodies are being surrounded, our bodies are being blockaded, our bodies are being attacked upon, and it's painful. It's painful, you are not free, and power stops being an abstract idea or theories that we talk about, but it is something that is very visual, very physical, and you can feel it on your body. And so this is where I began. And this is Chinese University, where I graduated from and where I currently work. And during that time, I also did, I remember that this was a very hot day. It was a very hot day. Everyone was carrying their umbrella because there was no shades like along this avenue. And I remember it being a very hot day, and I remember looking up to this like a makeshift stage, and have a very strong feeling. Apart from bodies being very packed, very much packed together on a very hot day, is that I am looking up to the stage. And later I found this photo being taken from the stage, probably from the stage, and it is two very different views. And during the 2014 movement, apart from realizing that power acts on the body physically and that bodies are fragile, it is also that there are many ways of looking at things, and depending on your position, and one looking down, but one looking up and the other looking down. And it is at this point that I began working as someone who occupies the role, quote unquote, of a teacher. And I have decided to adopt, I have been trying, not I've decided to adopt, I've been trying to find a new way of, is there an other way? Is there a third way or other ways of relating to each other that is neither looking up or looking down? And thus began my experiment of trying to find a new way of relating to quote unquote students in classroom or outside. That is it possible for me to not be the teacher that I thought I have to be? And for me, it was this accumulation of experience of power, negative experience of power, that I think about my teaching and later my activism or my community organizing in newer ways, or thinking about it as a constant experimentation of finding, very much like what Paramita was saying, like new languages, new framework, new way of expressing it, new way of relating to one another. And I remember joining CUHK once again after my graduation, signing up for this. For those of you who are in Hong Kong or who is paying very close attention to Hong Kong's news, would know that she is no longer. This Statue of Liberty, of Hong Kong civil society, is no longer. But we'll get back to that later. And as I begin further down the road of me, I think it was shortly after I began to teach full-time at CUHK, and this happened. And so this was in 2000, I remember it should be in 2019 during the anti-extradition movement. And there was a battle. Basically, there was a battle at CUHK, and it was something that was it impacts people in a very physical way, of course. It impacts the school in a very physical way. There was a lot of destruction, a lot of invisible contamination because of the quote-unquote non-lethal chemical weapon that is used. But I remember I sat at home not being there on that day. I sat at home because my father was ill. So he was diagnosed of final stage cancer, and I didn't want him to be worried. I asked my friends and colleagues who were there whether I should go back or not, but they said that I should not. And I also feel like it was not a place for me because I'm physically weak. I can't run fast, I can't fight, there's no specific skills that I have. But I remember that day feeling like a piece of paper being like made into like a ball, and feeling very cranky, as well as the impact was very physical. The guilt, the survival guilt, the shame, and the fear was something that impacts me very physically. And everyone, including the school campus, everyone was scarred in one way or another of being there or being not there. And it impacted my teaching, or it impacted the thing that I value the most, teacher-student relationship, in a very physical way. Apart from the fact that, of course, like the immediate effect is that we can no longer see each other. So shortly after I joined the university, I can't see my student at all. We remain on Zoom for well over a year. And so the lovely end of class photos are turned into a digital selfie. But we value the time we spend together. The other thing about intimacy, or the other thing about distance, or digitized communication, is that you would not realize how it impacts you until you actually know the difference. I was quite happily using Zoom for the first half a year of the first term that I was asked to use Zoom because my father was sick, as I was saying, and then I was happy that I'm able to actually be by his side at home to constantly take care of him, not having to leave home to work. But then as time passes, I gradually realized my dissatisfaction, my anger, my frustration of not being connected. I realized that in order for my teaching to work, it depends much more on me speaking, or my PowerPoint, or my voice coming through, or the visual, or having the visual of me. I realized that seeing the faces of my students is equally as important, even though they are not making any sound. Seeing their faces, seeing their facial expression, seeing who they are, seeing where they are, seeing even if they are falling asleep or taking a nap or walking around with their dog or having lunch, means something to me, because there is much more to simply a face. I realized that in order for me to communicate, in order for me to teach, it is actually a communication that I constantly take visual cues from them, that I take verbal cues or other kinds of bodily facial cues from them in order for me to continue to be able to work. And so after 1 year, I was last term, we were able to once again begin to teach face-to-face. And I remember one of the things that my students was telling me, like upfront, is that you are much happier when you are teaching you are much happier when you are teaching face-to-face. And I realized that however much we are connected, or however much convenience that digital platforms or digital channels, I think it is very much like what Paramita was saying, that the desire to connect, the desire to be with one another is very much always there, and there is only so much that digital platforms can do. That while digitized communication is something that can help us break the boundary of physical distance, or of physical distance, of time zones, or of like physical limitation. But there is something, or probably it is an opportunity that help us realize that there is much more going on when we are actually in touch with each other. And I think I've got the cue from Teju that my time is running up. So probably later on during our discussion, that probably I'll get more chance to share my experience curating Women Festival. Thank you.